Good morning and welcome to OSU Extension's Agricultural and Natural Resources Madness Tournament of Education. My name is Julie Strauser and I'm a program assistant for the department. And we're doing this every day through the end of April. And we started this in mid-March or late March. So this is our way of bringing programs to you since you can't come and see us right now. So the replays are available for all of our past sessions. So be sure and go to the Ag Madness site and check out these things. So today our bracket is our AgrAbility team. And this morning we have Dr. Dee Jepson, and she is the Associate Professor and Director of our Agricultural Safety and Health for the college. And we have Laura Ackerman, and she's our Disability Services Coordinator with Ohio AgrAbility. So ladies, if you can hear me and are ready to start sharing your screen, I will let you take over.
Thanks, Julie. Hi, this is Laura Ackerman. I'm the Disability Services Coordinator for Ohio AgrAbility. Hoping the right screen is shared. Julie, do you see my PowerPoint?
Looks good. Looks good.
You always feel a little bit blind doing this. So welcome to Making Your Events, Festivals, and Agritourism Accessible to the Public. I'm going to give you a little overview of Ohio AgrAbility first. Our mission is promoting success in agriculture for Ohio's farmers and farm families who are coping with disability or a long-term health condition. On the screen here, we've got 4 pictures, and you'll find my presentation style. I do read everything to you, and I will describe pictures. As a disability services professional, I'm accustomed to presenting with audiences that might have people who are visually impaired, potentially hearing impaired, have a learning disability, or have difficulty accessing a presentation. So that's why I do this. I over-describe, or I describe just enough. The picture on my far left is of a man standing next to a red tractor. He's got a gray t-shirt on, and he's working on doing some repairs on a tractor. Depending on how large your screen is, you can see that he is actually using a standing wheelchair. It looks like it's a camouflage pattern. That's Jeff. He's one of our clients. Our next picture over is Harold and Bill. Bill is seated in a wheelchair. Harold is kneeling next to him, petting his sheepdog, Sadie. He's had 2, Sarah and Sadie. I believe that's Sadie. That's at our peer-to-peer picnic, summer meeting a few years ago. The next picture is a group of our Ohio AgrAbility farmers and their families. That was from 2016, a summer meeting that we held at Indian Lake in Ohio, and I will have to commend them twice as much because it had to have been at least 150 degrees that day. And they were so gracious and stopped and took a picture of us, with us, I should say. And then on the far right is another one of our clients, John, and right at the edge of a picture is a former colleague, Charlie. And John also uses a wheelchair, and he's sitting in front of a red tractor. So Ohio AgrAbility, we also provide education and resources to just about everybody: farmers, agricultural businesses and groups, healthcare, education, and disability professionals, and anyone who's interested in making farming safe and accessible. We have a few more pictures here. We have one on the far right of our ewe with our lamb. In the center, we have a red barn with the Ohio Bicentennial painted on the side. And then on the far right, we have a group of chickens heading out of their barn. Ohio AgrAbility, this is kind of an important one. Please note that we cannot purchase equipment, property. Honestly, we really can't purchase anything for farmers or provide them with financial support. We may make referrals to available agricultural, vocational, rehabilitation, or community service organizations, some of which may be able to purchase equipment or provide financial assistance directly to farmers. If you tune in later this afternoon at noon, you'll hear much more about our AgrAbility work process, but we do provide quite a bit of services. We don't purchase, but we do provide a lot of service to our farmers. And Ohio AgrAbility is part of a national network of state and regional AgrAbility projects. I believe there are 22 state and regional projects, as well as our national AgrAbility project, which is based at Purdue University. Funding is based on the U.S. Farm Bill and is competitively awarded on 4-year cycles. Funds are awarded to a state team comprised of a land-grant university and a nonprofit organization. In Ohio, that is The Ohio State University and Easter Seals of Greater Cincinnati. So we'll jump right in. An individual with a disability, which is who our target population is defined by the Americans with Disabilities Act as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, has a history or record of such an impairment, or is perceived by others as having such an impairment. Want to note that the Americans with Disabilities Act does not list the impairments that are covered. There's too many. There would be things being added and things would being missed. So if you're considering, does someone have a disability, you think of these three topics right here. So some of these are just some of the federal disability rights laws, but these are the ones that I think are most relevant to us today. The Architectural Barriers Act of 1968, buildings and facilities must comply with federal standards for physical accessibility. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973, in particular, Section 504. This says that any organization, any group, company, contractor, or organization that gets federal money has to provide accessibility. Ohio State University does get federal money, as does OSU Extension. So since 1973, and really before, we've been expected to provide accessibility. And the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, which was then amended in 2008. This says that has several different topics, but any American who has a disability has to be accommodated through employment, public facilities and buildings, communication, transportation, etc. So you might think, why do I need to have my event at an accessible site? I've never had anyone in a wheelchair come to any of my events. I'm going to pause and let you think about that. I've never had anyone in a wheelchair come to any of my events. Well, perhaps that's because they can't. And I bring that quote up. It's from our Ohio State University ADA coordinator, Scott Listner. I was listening to him on a radio interview once at WOSU, and he said that a restaurant owner had said that to him. Why do I have to be accessible? Nobody with a wheelchair has come to my restaurant. Well, that's probably because you have stairs out front and they can't. So it's kind of self-fulfilling. But I would refer back and say Rehab Act of 1973 and the ADA is why you need to. But if you think that people that don't have disabilities, there aren't that many in Ohio, I would actually show you that 14.1% of Ohioans have a disability. And at some point in their lives, 70% of all Americans will have either a temporary or permanent disability. 21% of Americans aged 15 and older have a disability, and 50% of Americans 65 and older presently have some sort of disability. That's based on the American Community Survey from the census in 2010. And they're actually at the end of this, there are handouts that you'll be able to go to our website and get. I have resources listed that I list a little more detail on types of disabilities. And then you can see the report that from Cornell where I got these statistics, but they do this every few years. But just wanted to emphasize that actually there are quite a number of people that have some type of a disability. So we have a couple of things that we're going to talk about here: accessibility, assistive technology, and accommodation or modification. So accessibility is creating a service, a facility, a physical environment where people can come in and access it without having to ask for assistance to access, use the services, come into the place. Assistive technology is technology that people use to have their independence. So this is technology, our smartphones are a lot of assistive technology. When you think of the speech to text, text to speech, the power wheelchairs, there's a lot of assistive technology. It can be very complex or it can be very simple. And then accommodation or modification is how we would alter the environment, the service, an event, some technology or equipment in order for people with a disability to use it. So our goals for creating accessibility, we want to be proactive and not reactive. Today we're speaking very specifically about events, fairs, festivals, agritourism. So events in settings where typically we invite the public in, or at least invite a select group of the public in. It's so much easier if you think about if someone shows up and you have to fix something right there. It's stressful for everyone. So the best way to do this is to be proactive, think ahead. Are you going to be able to cover every instance? Absolutely not. There was always a surprise, but you'd be amazed a lot of the time, and you might feel like, well, I didn't need to do anything. Nobody asked me. That's perfect, because you had set up such an environment, such a facility or agritourism site that people can come in, enjoy it, interact, have a great time, and you don't even know, and that is your goal. So in order to be proactive and not reactive, you want to plan the event and then you want to review it. We have an accessibility checklist. Later, again, like I said, we have a handout. It's got a more extensive checklist. And you want to utilize universal design, which Dee will talk about a little later in this presentation. Really, I feel like all disability law comes back to the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Treat people the way you want to be treated. I know that I want to go. How do I want to interact with a program, site, or event with no restrictions? I want to show up with my friends and family. I want to enjoy myself. I want to go hit the corn maze. I want to do whatever the agritourism or festival is. And then I want to leave. And I just want to have a good time. I don't want to have a lot of people making adjustments for me when I get there. So your accessibility golden rule is think about how you want to be treated. How would you want your family, your friend, to be treated when you arrived at a place? That is our accessibility golden rule. So answering questions about accessibility. Okay, good. Answering questions about accessibility and requests for accommodations. You may get a phone call. You may have someone go to your website, send you an email. Good idea is to list areas of your site that are accessible. Think creatively to problem solve. The reason really our agritourism topics came up was a few years ago. I was at work. I had a phone call from a woman who had a small pumpkin patch, and they had it open to the public. Pumpkin patches are maybe a month or two, and I'm probably exaggerating with how long a pumpkin patch is really open and viable. But she said, I just got a phone call from someone who said they use a wheelchair and they wanted to know if they could come to my pumpkin patch. And what happens is they come in off the road, they park. We have this great hay wagon that everybody gets on the hay wagon, and we take them for a ride to the pumpkin patch, and they pick their pumpkins and they come back. She said, they asked, am I able to go to the pumpkin patch? And I said, no, because they can't get on the hay wagon. And now I'm really scared that I'm going to get sued. So I did not agree with her, which my supervisor Dee will be proud because she thinks that I tell people they're going to get sued too often. But I said, well, hopefully they will still come out. And is there some reason that they could not drive their own vehicle from the road instead of parking, drive back to the pumpkin patch, get a pumpkin and leave? Well, I guess not. I think that would be the easiest thing. It's not ideal. You don't want everybody driving back and forth. But I expect a lot of people would enjoy being able to get onto that hay wagon and ride it. But if not, if it's a choice between me riding the hay wagon or not getting to go or driving, I'm going to drive so that I can still participate. So that was creative problem solving. Also, ask for time to provide accommodations. Up to a week is reasonable for most requests. If someone needs a sign language interpreter or something maybe a little bit more in depth, you might need a little bit more time. But even the law does not think it's reasonable for you to be able to produce one at a snap. And when I also say think creatively to problem solve, there is absolutely nothing wrong with talking to people and saying, the person who called about the pumpkin patch, well, have you ever been in a situation like this before and how did you solve it? They may just want to say, I can just drive, that's fine. And I can speak in generalities, but a person who has a disability, they can often be world-class problem solvers because they've had to be. Because you might just now be encountering their particular disability. They may have lived with it their whole life or at least some length of time to where they know workarounds. It's totally okay to ask. So the cost of accessibility. Many accommodations are low cost or they don't cost anything at all. The pumpkin patch example, it wouldn't have cost them anything to say, go ahead and just drive. It would have been no trouble at all. There are some things that do cost, but any business or event that is open to the public, must be accessible. That does not mean if your pumpkin patch also has a working dairy farm at it that is not open to the public, dairy farm does not need to be accessible unless it's open to the public, and then just those parts. Pumpkin patch does. And there is no exemption for temporary events. There is no exemption for things that are open just a few weeks. So we want to use universal design concepts to welcome everyone. And I am going to go to that third rail and talk about service animals. Some of my favorite news stories on my news feed now are service animals and therapy animals, just because there's so much. It's so interesting. So service animals are service dogs or miniature horses only. Service animals are service dogs or miniature horses only according to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Emotional support or therapy animals are not covered under the ADA and do not generally have to be admitted. I will say there are a few workarounds with that. Airlines have their own set of rules, ships, etc. They have their own Americans with Disabilities Act law. They're different. If you have a dormitory at a college, or you have summer camp, or you have something where housing occurs, the Fair Housing Act is much more broad, and therapy and emotional support animals may have to be admitted. We're not talking about that today, but I wanted to throw that in. But under the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's service dogs or miniature horses. There are two questions you can ask when determining if an animal is a service animal. Is the dog or miniature horse a service animal required because of a disability? What work or task has the animal been trained to perform? You cannot ask for a demonstration of the animal's work. You cannot ask for documentation for the animal or about the nature of the person's disability. Going to go back to that middle point. You cannot ask for documentation of the animal because there is no such thing. There are any number of diploma mills selling certificates that say this is a certified service animal. If it's not recognized under the ADA, and that's just someone who is trying to make some money off, most people don't realize there is no certification. You will often see a service dog wearing a vest or a harness that says service dog at work. They're not required to wear those, and based on the nature of their work, they may or may not be on a leash. They frequently are, but there are service animals whose job requires them to walk off of a leash and to be able to move more freely from their owner. There is a lot more about accommodating service animals, what they can and can't do, the responsibility of the animal's owner and handler, and the responsibility of business owners and others on the handout. Because I could spend at least a good half an hour, 45 minutes on service animals, but I won't. So how do you make your event, festival, or agritourism accessible? You provide reasonable accommodations. To determine what is reasonable, you must first consider what is not reasonable. You can ask what accommodations they need, like I had said before about the pumpkin patch. She could have said, how have you handled this? How would you like to see this handled? You can ask what accommodations they need. This does not commit you to providing exactly what they request, if you can provide access another way. I think it's always a good idea to take that person's wishes into account and what they can and can't do, but you're not obligated. Do you have to agree to every accommodation request? Not if it is an unreasonable request, okay? Don't have to agree if it's an unreasonable request. Unreasonable is not based on your personal opinion. There is legal guidance for what may be considered unreasonable. A request is not reasonable and does not have to be granted if it requires a substantial change or alteration in the curriculum or an essential element of a course or program. If it fundamentally alters the nature of the service provided, if it poses a direct threat to the health or safety of others, if it poses an undue financial hardship or an administrative burden. Just going to touch on that last one. When we talk about, so let's say, for instance, Julie D. and I, we work at The Ohio State University, as do many thousands of other people. If our AgrAbility program is asked to provide an accommodation and it's very expensive and it's outside of our budget, we cannot say, we can't afford it. No, sorry, that's unreasonable because it would break our budget. Because if it went to court, the court would say, okay, Ohio AgrAbility, I agree, you don't have the money to pay for this thing. However, the Ohio State University does have that money. So it will not just look at your small department, your county, your master gardener group, whatever it is. They will look at the larger corporation, the larger company, university, whatever it is. So it's your entire business. I'd mentioned before that maybe a dairy farm could have a pumpkin patch. The pumpkin patch probably does not make a lot of money. I don't know, but I wouldn't imagine it would make a huge amount of money. But if there happened to be an accommodations request that was going to cost them money and they said, we can't afford it, it wouldn't be the pumpkin patch's finances they would want to see. It would be the entire dairy farm. And perhaps, and that's what they would base it on. So who pays for the accommodations? The organizer or host of the event or festival, or the owner-operator of the event, festival, agritourism venue. You cannot charge a person for accommodations. If someone comes and says, I need a sign language interpreter to go to your workshop, you cannot charge them. I will admit right now, sign language interpreting can be very, very expensive. However, it is part of the cost of doing business, being an American society. You do need to find a way to pay for that. What if the requested accommodation is expensive? Is that unreasonable? Probably not, for the reason I already told you. They'll look at the entire business. So if it was anything to do with Ohio State, they would look at Ohio State, not just a small program. Have a few examples of unreasonable requests. So some things that might be, so when we looked back at unreasonable requests, the first one was an alteration to a course or curriculum. That may not be so relevant here in these. That would definitely be at a college. That could be at some place where you have an ongoing teaching. So it's not necessarily here. When we're talking about this health or safety of others, that could be, we frequently come across things like this, say at 4-H camp or at the county fair, where there's a concern that maybe a 4-H'er can't control the horse or the cow or whatever it is that they're showing. So we look at ways that we could make it safer. Frequently, as a formerly very independent child myself, I would have really been pushing back at having someone say, well, you need to have someone go into that ring with you and your horse. We have had a few instances where the parent has refused to let someone accompany a horse, and nothing has gone terribly wrong, but a child has lost control and someone stepped in, or the child was frightened. So if your request, I need to be accommodated by doing this, could put someone else at risk, it's not reasonable. When you're talking about completely altering a whole program, that could be, we'll go to the, well, let's say that someone has a terrible allergy to pollen and corn pollen, dust, animal hair. We can't make an animal barn at the fair or at the petting zoo dust animal hair free, because the nature of that site is that. So asking someone to completely change, you need to remove all chemicals, dust, etc. from this horse show, it's not going to happen. And then we've already talked about being expensive. Good. And there are more examples on the handout. So before people arrive at your event, festival, or agritourism site, you need an accessible website so that they can come and check it out and see what's going to happen. You need accessible electronic promotional and marketing materials, handouts, resources. Check your documents with free screen reader software, caption videos. There are links for all of these things on the handout, and provide Braille documents when asked. We did have an instance of this a few summers ago. They were going to have a class, I believe it was the Toledo area, and our Lucas County Extension was partnering with an agency that served people who are visually impaired. A few of them had asked for the handouts to be provided in Braille. I was contacted. I contacted our ADA office and they were ready to do it. And I said, you know, if you're already working with this agency who serves people who are blind, could you ask them if they could provide the Braille documents, if we could provide the Word documents that were in the proper format? We had to have a few documents updated so that they were accessible by a screen reader, and then that agency printed off the Braille. So that's one workaround, because Braille is not inexpensive to produce, but they were happy to do that for us. This is especially for OSU people. You need to, but probably a good idea. It's definitely a good idea for everyone. Include a non-discrimination and accommodations request notice. Use a non-discrimination statement on all resources, handouts, and web pages. And you should also include the event organizer contact information for requesting accommodations. This is required for anything at OSU. We have statements, again, they're on the handout from the College of Food, Ag, and Environmental Sciences. We have our own statement, and it's a good idea. It's kind of thing within the disability community. The expectation is if you don't ask for someone to request, if you don't put out a request for accommodations, the assumption is that those accommodations will be there when you arrive. Sometimes I think that's a reasonable expectation, but if you're talking about something more involved, like sign language interpreter, having a stage to get, having a ramp to get up on a stage for an awards program, not having latex balloons at an event happened recently, you should definitely have let people know who to ask to request accommodations. Have a short accessibility checklist here. Go over your site, go over your website documentation, review it. If you were visually impaired, if you were seated in a wheelchair, you were using a walker, other mobility device, or another disability, could you park, travel across the parking lot, enter the site safely? Keyword being safely. Is there a safe route from where you're parking and getting in? Are you going to have to cross crazy traffic or anything like that? Can you reach or access the ticket booth? If you can't reach into the counter, can the person walk around, transact the tickets? Can you push or pull open doors? Can you locate a bathroom or an accessible entrance to a building? Can you access the buildings that need accessed? No stairs or thresholds. Can you get in through a ramp? If you can get in through a ramp, is the door at the top of that ramp able to be opened and closed by a person who's in a wheelchair or has maybe a walker? Can you get on the stage to an accepted award if that might happen? Can you safely move throughout the site with no barriers and obstacles? And can you recognize and access emergency exits? So that's a very simple accessibility checklist. I believe I do have an online one that's probably dozens of pages that the ADA has produced that goes a little more in depth. So that's it for me. And now we're going to talk, Dee's going to talk about universal design.
Thank you, Laura. Very good overview. And I know that if there are questions, there'll be a chance that you can put those questions in the chat box, because there's a lot of information shared about the ADA. So when we think about universal design, it's not necessarily ADA, but it certainly can, it can come into play with assisting you with that operation, or putting that into your own operation relatively inexpensively. When we define universal design, it is the creation of products and environments that are meant to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible, without the need for adaptation or specialization. So many of you probably already could give examples of what a universal design product would be, as we have them in our homes, we have them in our workplaces. If you think about the door levers that are on your doors instead of doorknobs, or the rocker switches to turn your lights on and off instead of those old flip switches. So those would be examples of universal design. You could buy them anywhere and install them anywhere. They're useful for all people. So let's take some universal design concepts and some of the ADA concepts that Laura reviewed, and put those into an agritourism or a farm market. You know, when you invite people to your farm, let's put these universal design practices in place and give you some examples. So let's start at the beginning of your agritourism operation. Let's start in the parking lot. So do you have reserved parking spaces where you would post signs for accessible parking? Spaces should be close to the accessible entrance, near a safe walkway, and free of debris. One of the photos that we have here is a photo taken in the wintertime of a parking lot where the snow plow cleared the parking lot and piled all of that snow into the handicap parking spot. And so that is definitely debris, and then that no longer makes that space accessible for a person who may need that parking space. The recommendation is that you have one accessible parking space for every 25 non-accessible spaces. So even if you're on a farm and you're plotting out the size of the field or the lot that you would like the folks to park in, you would have an idea of how many spaces you will need for every 25 cars that would come to your operation. I have another photo here that shows the sign for handicap parking, and it says reserved on it. It's the traditional blue background with the white letters, and those are available for purchase and to acquire. You could even download those possibly from the ADA website and laminate them and put them out on your property using T-posts just to mark those. So it's a very cost-effective and good thing to do. On our next slide, we will have leaving the parking lot and then going into the walkways. Remember, I said have the handicap parking close to accessible walkways. Well, an accessible walkway would be something that's smooth surface, but not slippery. Sometimes if we do have concrete, we could groove that concrete. So that puts cuts into the concrete so it's not real slippery if they're using a walker or a cane. We want to make sure that the walkway is free of debris and barriers on the path. Sometimes mulch paths are difficult to traverse because the size of the mulch. Gravel paths are sometimes hard because either wheelchairs, walkers, or canes can get caught up in the rocks. And plus, it's just very difficult. It's cumbersome to move across those types of paths. A lot harder because of the friction and not being able to just make a steady pace with your feet. We also want to make sure the path is wide enough for a wheelchair. So 36 inches or wider is the criteria for that. So if you would take your yardstick and make sure that your paths are 36 inches all the way up to your facility and then even all around your facility. When you get to the end of a aisle or a run or any place where you have to change direction, we would need a 60-inch diameter turnaround space. So if you think about a garden center, sometimes this time of year with the plants and the bedding materials are all putting in there, and if the person did want to access that greenhouse or garden center, when they got to the end of those rows of potted plants, a 60-inch diameter is what would be required then to turn around. And some of our greenhouses really don't have that kind of space. But if you're wanting to follow the guidelines, the 60-inch diameter is what you would need at the end of each of those aisles. And I have a little photo there off to the right that kind of shows someone using not just a wheelchair, but a mobility scooter where they can make that turn and heading to a different angle and a different direction. When you think about your accessible entrances and your ticket booths, those ticket counters should be no higher than 36 inches high. And that is so someone can walk up to that and look into the ticket booth. We do recommend that if you have ramps that you think about the steepness of that ramp. So 1 inch rise for every 12-inch run. If you, Laura had talked, she shared a lot of good examples of why we would recommend no steps. But we'd also want you to think about the thresholds or other barriers, not just the steps where a person can access. And if that's the case, if you happen to have the steps, we understand that, but then you need to take into consideration where else can you have the folks enter your facility. So we have a photo of steps in the next slide that clearly are very difficult to, if you had to take those concrete steps to get to the gate, to get up to the ticket counter or anywhere else, that would be a barrier. So you notice we have a sign placed with an arrow in this picture, and it is pointing to an accessible exit or an accessible entrance. It wouldn't matter if it said entrance or exit, but it would point to an accessible area that if you encountered this work site, you would say, okay, I can't come into your business this way, but here's the arrow showing me where I want to go. Speaking of where we want to go, bathrooms are very important and everyone needs to go. And so this is part of our biology lesson. We need to make sure we have accessible restrooms. They can be permanent or they can be temporary. You should have at least 1 accessible stall per bathroom. Now, in some of the situations, you might have a unisex porta-john, and we have photos here on the slide that would show different styles that we have seen. But porta-johns can be handicap accessible. So if you're going to reserve one and pay for that expense, go ahead and get the larger one. Everybody will appreciate that as well, especially those that need it. Then again, you have it there, it's universal. No one has to ask where your accessible bathroom is. You've already provided an accessible facility. There's no need to ask where one might be. So if you're going to rent any of these, rent at least one of them to be a portable bathroom. In our photo, the photo that we have labeled no, not accessible, although it's a very nice trailer, and some of these are air conditioned, some of them have the sinks right there with running water, but you'll see that there are steps to access and get into that trailer, which makes that the no choice. And then the other 2 pictures, one is from the outside looking at the porta-john, and you'll see very small, but it is designated as a handicap accessible facility because it has the universal logo for the person in the wheelchair. And then when you open the door, you'll see that it does have railings along the side and the movement that's necessary to make those proper turns. So that's why that is indicated as yes. When we think about where we would want to put audiences, if you were going to have a stage or any type of performance, the seating is important for making that handicap accessible and using universal design concepts. The area should be with a good line of sight. And so in the photo there on the left, you'll see a person in a wheelchair, and she's sitting higher than the others in the amphitheater, lower than her, that even if they stand up or move around, her line of sight is not blocked by any of that movement below her. We cannot charge any extra for this premium seating. It is handicap accessible and it should be designated as such. Also, Laura talked about if you are going to have an awards program or if there's any need for anyone to come to the stage, having a ramp would be better than having a set of stairs. And this is good for just good universal design practices. It impedes any type of mobility impairment, that fumbling up on stage or tripping to get to the stage. It just kind of eliminates that for everyone if you have a ramp. In any agritourism operation, if you are farming and you invite the public to your farm, if you invite school children and school buses to your farm, if you're having a field day and you've invited half the county or the cattle producers, or, you know, to have a picnic, you really need to think about emergency exits and the emergency exit routes. This is right up there with, you know, how fast can you evacuate an area if you need to get the cars out of your, off of your farm, if there was a fire or if there was any other type of emergency. So when I think globally about emergency exits and routes, I'm thinking first what happens in the parking lot and how quickly we can get people out if we need to. And we also need to think about how to get people onto our facility or onto our operation. If there was an emergency, can you get the fire trucks in? Can you get an ambulance in? Because that's also part of the emergency routes. Now, what I have on the slide, though, is really talking about once they're on a site or if they're in a building, how are you marking your emergency exits and your doors? And we want to make sure that those doors are not obstructed by other materials. They cannot be locked doors, and they cannot lead to dead-end corridors, meaning they can't go down a hallway to nothing. So we want to keep the exit routes free of any type of stacked materials, explosive or flammable products, and any other decorations. And by decorations, we can't hang garland or decorations over those exit signs. That's not appropriate, and it's actually illegal to do so. If you are in a building and you need to post the signs, you would post those along the route, indicating the direction of travel that you want the folks to travel just to get out. And if there are doors, extra doors in this area that lead to maybe just another room or a broom closet even, we would want to mark those doors that would say not an exit. So I've shown a sign, given you an example here of a sign that you could post on maybe your supply room door, or any place that you do not want the public to go into, especially during an emergency, that would say not an exit. And then the other sign that we have on the left, that's the appropriate size. There are some specifications for how you need to mark your exits with the large letters. This sign is illuminated, which is preferred, but they don't all have to be. And these signs are readily available at some of your box stores or even online. So make sure you mark your exits. When we think about going to fairs, festivals, large livestock events, here is a photo taken at a county fair. One on the left is a beef operation. There's some Hereford cattle taking a break there, lounging on their sawdust. As a young producer, she's in there checking on them, maybe looking for manure to pick up. And then you'll see a bunch of debris in the aisleways. You'll see their cattle blowers are there with the long hoses. You see buckets and even their manure carts off into the distance. So all of this is in the aisleways, and it's difficult to traverse. We understand that at livestock shows you do have a lot of equipment and you are working because your job is to put your animals on exposition, but we show this picture as a slip, trip, and fall type of hazard, and it's certainly not accessible for others, compared to the photo on the right, which is a nice clean aisleway. That was at a county fair where, you know, you see their decorations are hanging high enough that the animals can't reach those, or that they don't come down and touch the workers as they're going in to handle the animals. But what I have on the slide is that, are your doorways, aisles, and walkways smooth? Are they safe and clear of obstructions and obstacles? Laura gave a great example of a hay ride, and whether you are going to offer hay rides or not. Well, if you are, you would want to maybe consider a hay wagon that was accessible. We have a photo here of a wagon that it's more of a, it's a 2-axle wagon, more rated to be pulled by a pickup truck or a smaller utility tractor. But it's not your typical hay wagon that you would think of that has been retrofitted. It truly is designed for handicap accessibility. It has a ramp on the back where everyone can enter the back area. There is no steps for anyone. And so you can safely get to this wagon and you can be seated. When we take older hay wagons and convert them for people movers, there are some considerations that you have to make. First off, the height of those old traditional hay wagons are certainly not as low as the picture that you see here. And so the rise and run of that ramp might be extremely steep. Those axles and tires on the older wagons may not be rated as well as what you see here in this photo. That is this trailer is actually a utility trailer that has been converted, not a hay wagon that's been converted. So I'd like for folks to think about and rethink how they move people around and that they're doing so safely. You'll also see that this photo has, there's no place really for a person to fall out. The sides are tall enough, especially if they are seated in the seat and not standing on the seat. But when you're standing on a traditional hay wagon, if you're going to convert one of those as people movers, you need to install railings at hip height. So your rails should be about 42 inches tall, and it should have a mid-rail of 21 inches, just so people cannot slip through the cracks and fall. Plus, they might need to stabilize themselves and have handholds. So we really advise not to take those old traditional wagons and convert them to people movers. If you have the wherewithal to redesign them, that would certainly be preferred. Now, if you don't have any type of transportation that's accessible for your guests and you do want them to be able to get around your property, you can allow the guests to drive their own vehicle to the site, whether that's to the pumpkin patch or out to the orchard. So in our next slide here, we're showing a picture of a site. If you have a corn maze and you would like your guests to be able to drive out to the corn maze, then driving out to the corn maze is possible. But then once they're there, is the corn maze accessible for their walking? And so to make it accessible, we'd like to maintain a smooth and compact path that's free of the plants. You might need to cut back the corn stalks, which in some of the mazes, you're already cutting back the corn stalks. But chances are when you planted that field, you planted the entire field, and then you went in and established the course for the maze. In this example that we show here, that is a very worn and established path. So the path leads through the corn, and you could tell that the stalks are still not standing. So that the planter that year did not cross that path. The planter stayed on either side. Now, chances are we can't do this with every corn maze. So if you're going to mow off those stalks, you really need to mow them completely to the ground and remove them, because if you've ever walked through some fields that had corn established in it, you know that it's very difficult to walk, even with the stalks protruding out of the ground. In our next photo, we're going to show you a picture of a orchard, and here we have the car that can pull up to the orchard, and maybe the person then can get out and do some picking. The path is certainly wide enough for anyone to be able to traverse that path. So not just orchards, vineyards and tree farms are similar. We'd want to plant our trees, our pumpkins, our vines, so that there's at least that 36 inches between the rows, and not just the rows of plant to plant, but where those plants may vine out or branch out. We want to leave that 36-inch path all the way through. And we could set aside an area on the edges of the orchard or the pumpkin patch that's specifically for handicap accessibility. So in other words, maybe mark those areas, and I don't have that marked in this photo, but it would be a great idea that you could put up the handicap accessible sign and say, you know, if you're able to walk further into the patch, please leave these pumpkins, or please leave these berries or apples for our handicapped guests. And then that's just courteous that they can still get to the pumpkins. And that's what we see here on this next slide, pumpkins that are very close to the trail, very close to that accessible patch. And then others can walk in and pick pumpkins out of the entire field, but perhaps even, you know, some of our senior members of our public, they don't need to walk all the way in to get their pumpkin. Let the grandkids run and get the pumpkins further out, and they'll get their pumpkins close to the edge. So this slide says public perception matters. And it is a news story of a young girl. Her name is Alyssa Warren. She's a disabled child, as explained in the news release. And she's a cute little, looks like maybe a 4-year-old gal. She's got a cute bow in her hair, happy shirt, yellows and pinks. And across the bottom, it says, no rides for this disabled girl at the Dyer County Fair. It does say 8-year-old girl is turned away. Now that's very bad press. The public would see this, they would see that the young girl clearly wanted to go on a ride. But when you think about just the whole situation around this, is it really bad marketing, or is it something that someone else decided is negative? Because that was getting back to some of the slides where Laura talked about, do you have to make things accessible for everyone? In this situation, the ride worker would have had to transport this gal on and off of the ride. And is that really within that ride worker's job description to do that? Or should everyone be able to walk up and get on the ride themselves, get themselves locked into their seats, that the ride worker, it's not his or her responsibility to do that? And so in this situation is probably very bad press, but there was probably rules from that ride company that says, you know, you need to get yourself on and off of these rides. So perhaps not all of the rides would be available for handicapped folks. They would have to choose a different ride. So in this situation, it looks like bad press, but when you really look at the legality of it, the ride operator was probably in the right. Now on the next slide, we show a picture that happened, and this is a feel-good kind of story as far as public perception. And it's allowing a disabled teen to show their hog during the fair. And we know that in Ohio 4-H, we do have the winning plan, and we make sure that everyone can do the best that they can with their helpers if they need to, but to show how they have raised their animals and if they can exhibit them at a county fair. Although we do know that taking an animal to the fair is a privilege for all of us, it does not show that you did not complete the project just because you could raise it successfully. So I always kind of put that in there too, especially in the year of the COVID, and we're talking now already about not having county fairs and what to do with some of the livestock that we've raised for a fair. I said, well, taking it to the fair is just a privilege. It's not showing that you didn't complete the project. The last slide leaves you with some resources that we have on our Ohio AgrAbility website. We have 32 fact sheets. Everything from universal design on the farm and assistive technology for the farm. We have handouts for accessibility and agritourism and accommodations. Most of the information that we shared with you today is in handout form, and you can access that on our website. We also have an Ag Safety Stat newsletter, which are archiving some of our past stories, and we have an Ohio AgrAbility and Action component of that source. And all of this will be at our website. And our website is on the next slide, and it will be at the agrability.osu.edu, where you can find more information and even reach out to Laura and myself, either with the contact information on the slide or through our website. And this concludes our session today on designing accessible events, whether it's for your festival, your own agritourism operation, and when you invite the public to your operation. So with that, we will conclude today and ask if there's any questions. And thank you for your time on a Friday.
Thank you, Dee. At this time, if any of the attendees have a question, they can put it in the chat box or in the Q&A. And while we're waiting on that, I want to thank Dee and Laura so much for sharing your time and knowledge with us today. I've learned so much and it's been very informative. I don't see any questions. Make sure here. And I posted the website for everybody in the chat. So I think we're good to go. So I hope everybody comes back at noon when we return for assistive technology to assist farming. So we'll see you back at noon. Thanks, everyone.